Welcome to the Qualia Experience podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Qualia Experience podcast. On today's episode, we welcome our guest, neuroscientist, Dr. Schweigert Bastos. Born and raised in Brazil, Dr. Bastos moved to the United States in 2015 to further her education, earning a bachelor's in biotechnology from Penn State University before obtaining her master's and PhD in neuroscience at Georgia State University. And as a fellow active alumnus, I would like to say, go Panthers. Dr. Bastos' doctoral work focused on context processing and the visual system. Today, she's a researcher at the University Clinic of Bonn in Germany, where she studies pathophysiology of epilepsy, probing the boundaries of neural circuits and altered states of consciousness. But our curiosity doesn't stop at the lab bench, and to prove this, today we'll be discussing a few of the big questions, a mix between science and philosophy. For example, how psychedelics rewire perception, free will, consciousness, and what is the self. We'll also cover the similarities in altered states of consciousness induced during a spiritual, psychedelic, or psychotic episode, and much more. Dr. Bastos' work sits at the crossroads of rigorous neuroscience research and existential inquiry. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. Bastos. Today we'll be focused on the topic of consciousness and the mind. I thought this would be an interesting conversation to have with you. I've always been fascinated about neuroscience, how the mind works, how the mind is connected to consciousness, how we get our awareness, and what is real and what is elusive. So we'll get right to it. The first question I would want us to tackle would be what is known as the God spot in the brain. Neurotheology and the biology of belief. Studies show that religious experiences like meditation, prayer, or mystical states activate a specific neural network. Does this mean spirituality is purely a product of brain chemistry, or could these be circuits returned to perceive something beyond material reality?
Okay, so to start with that, I feel like I want to make a point that is probably going to come up in different other conversations that we have as well, because I have a really big problem with the way that people frame sometimes this question of whether something is real or not if it has a biological sort of fundamental, right? So they say whether God exists or is a creation of your mind. I think this is a very ambiguous way of thinking, right? Like to put it in one place, whether if something is biological, that's not real. And if something is something else, then it's just a product of our minds, right? We are biological beings, and everything that we experience is going to come from biology, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about the self or religion as something that is not real because it can be explained by biology, I think that that's just like a wrong assumption. And actually, a lot of philosophers get stuck into that sort of fundamental into their questions. And this just pushes away for actually understanding what the brain is and what the mind is. The mind is a product of the brain. That doesn't mean that the mind is not real, right? The brain is not like a third entity that is creating a reality around us. The brain is us, right? I don't have a brain. I am a brain in that sense. But when talking about religion, I believe that religion is not religion, but faith is a very fundamental part of the human experience. Just point blank. I do think it is created by the mind, but doesn't necessarily mean that this is not real, right? Because if you think that everything that we experience goes through our minds, so that doesn't mean that the experience of God is not real. But now if you want to think
Real,
about,
sorry, just to cut you up, real in the sense of physical or real in the sense of the unknown?
I think real in the sense of it exists through the only lens that we can call existence, which is our perception. So I think for the moment that if there is one person that feels one specific thing, I think that is real to that one person. I think reality expands as you can connect your reality that exists inside your mind with the reality of other people. And then you have the sort of like expansion in consciousness. And I think that this is what actually happens through evolution for us to become this advanced human society that exists. But then to your question,
Basically, reality is subjective.
I think subjective, but I don't like the term illusion because I don't think it's not real. It's subjective. And that's very much real because that's all we got is our subjective experience of the world. But to my opinion, I don't think this sort of spiritual reality exists outside of our minds. But that doesn't mean that this cannot be something that is very real for the individuals that feel it, and that is not something that can change your life or can impact meaningfully your life in very different ways. It's the human experience to have faith and to have the spirituality.
So, from what I understand, is basically everything that we experience is from the mind. Ruling spirituality as different, it's not going to be fair because even what we think is real or physical is also generated in the mind. Is that the, what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Like even our experiences of the laws of physics, right?
Yeah.
You have, we understand the laws of physics into a very molecular level, very detailed level, but what we experience from it, like something falling on your feet or the way that you see colors and you see everything around you, that's an experience that reflects a physical reality, but the experience of it is very much subjective. So I think it's hard to disentangle those two things, right? But I do think that we as humans have one experience of reality. We have the experience of reality, and also other living animals to some extent. But our mind gives this different quality of life than, the table or the tree itself, because we have more complex inside our minds that we can connect with this outside world and give meaning to it through our consciousness.
Okay. Yeah. To go to the next question, I would read this. If we could induce a divine encounter with brain stimulation, like the God helmet experience, which was developed by Stanley Coren and neuroscientist Michael the Singer, if the God helmet experiment was accurate, would that inducement undermine or deepen spiritual belief? What's your take on this?
So I want to say that I think we already have something like the God helmet. And I think those are psychedelic drugs.
Okay.
Really.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting question. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. I guess we could sort of go back and forth and try to understand this together because it's something that I think about. There's a lot of triggers to something that we're going to call something like a divine experience, a transcendent experience, right? There's three main triggers, let's say, that I can think of in my mind. I think a religious experience, either through, classical religions have music and fasting and big walks, or sometimes meditation as well, some sort of meditation. This can trigger a very strong spiritual experience. I think psychedelic drugs, the historical use of psychedelic drugs was in a religious context. Tribes in the Amazon and so many different places on earth, their whole culture sometimes surrounds themselves through these psychedelic drugs. So in that context, it does strengthens the connection with God. Another sort of spiritual experience or something that resembles a spiritual experience, and I think if I go a lot into this direction, maybe it will get a little controversial, but I think the experience of psychosis. Throughout my PhD, some of the work that I was doing was sort of trying to look for this cellular basis of this biomarker of schizophrenia. Just reading through the experience of people that go through a psychotic episode, a lot of it talks about I am God and like I'm here for a purpose and I connect. They have this godlike complexes that I feel like in some ways resembles like, they have the feeling like they've been touched by a divine force. So I feel like there's a lot of similarities into these three things. And I think that this represents somewhat consciousness. I think it represents what the brain is about in some ways. I think it talks about beliefs, especially if you think of the brain as a system that ever since you're born is collecting information, right? The brain basically doesn't know what the world is before you were born. It has these different regions, they're coding or like sort of like predisposed to be the visual cortex or the frontal lobe and all of that, but it doesn't know the neurons inside your head don't have this contact with the world. It receives information in this physical form. And ever since you're born, it tries to create this model of what the world is. And this model is something simple as like, I know that the sky is blue, I know what a chair looks like, but also it's contextual in the sense of culture as well. Right. So
That's basically you're influenced by where you were born, the parents you have, their own influences, and how they grew up and stuff like that.
yeah. And I think that this defines how you see the world. Right.
Yeah.
Again, is sort of this idea that everything is created by the brain, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's an illusion, right? I think you have an internal model of reality inside your brain, and this is the lens of perceptions that you have is through this internal model. What happens when you have a sort of strong religious, psychedelic, or psychotic experience is that this model of the world that you have around you, it's somewhat broken, at least for a second. This is what, at least doing psychedelics, I think it's more clear how you have this sort of like erase of your priors of what you expect from situations, and then everything that you perceive feels so intense. Right? This can either go one way or another. And it's not about the moment that you're having the experience or the psychedelic or the religious or the psychotic experience, is actually the afterwards. And I would just take the psychotic experience a little bit out of the equation because I think that that comes from a more profound disorder of the brain. But this sort of self-induced or not spontaneous, but with intention that you have through a religious experience or a psychedelic. I think what happens is basically your brain goes kaput, like for a second. Do you expand your consciousness in the sense that your brain is just different areas of the brains are connecting with different areas? You lose this usual sort of moderation that you have, that is the contrast between your internal model of reality with your physical reality. And then you go to this experience, you have this crazy feelings, hallucinations, and all of that, and then you come back from it. And then I think what happens after this psychedelic experience or this religion experience is what matters a lot. I think you have a blank slate somewhat because you just went through a very strong experience, and the context of the life or the content of the things that you experience afterwards kind of fill up this, and then you generate new beliefs. So you had a system of beliefs before, and then this can be used to strengthen that system of belief. So in a context of religion, if you think about where the psychedelics came from, um, they will say these people, these entities that you saw, those are your ancestors. And it would be sort of related to your context, the sort of hallucinations you have, the encounters you have. So this could use to strengthen it. But then on the other hand, because you have this shift so much, or like this eraser of your system of beliefs before, you can also use to change someone's mind in some ways, because it depends on the content that you feed them afterwards.
Yeah.
And on the context that you are.
So do you think this is a positive experience, or you think it's still all on the, like you said, I don't want to use the word illusion, but do you think that it brings about a better result after the experience? Do you think it's good that we all go through some sort of induced experience, maybe psychedelics or maybe through religion, to get a better grasp of our own reality or subjective reality?
I think faith is the thing that is important for all human beings. And I don't mean a religion, but a faith. And I can talk more about this, but I don't think everyone should go through a psychedelic experience, to be quite honest. I think it actually can be very dangerous. And I say this from a perspective, half of my dissertation was on psychedelics. And I've thought about it. I've used psychedelics before, and I'm very much with my eyes on the field. And it can have therapeutical potential, but it also it's not a thing that, you're trying to figure out, like you try to have a different experience and you go and do it. Depends on the psychedelic you take, on the levels and how much, but having this whole hero experience of taking a lot of psychedelics, and I think that's a very heavy experience, and you don't know really what happens after it because you have this sort of shift in beliefs inside of you. And the thing is, like, if the psychedelics, they came from these religious tribes for a reason. They serve a very important purpose in those those situations, that context, because it strengthens the sort of the bond between the people on the tribe. And they have already a book of for you to interpret that experience that you had. They have everything, within their culture to explain what you just had. But if someone that, we live in a high-tech world with capitalism and so many things happen at once, and if you go so deep inside yourself and these notions of reality and existence, when you go through a psychedelic experience like that, how do you come back to a capitalistic, fast-paced world? And a lot of people don't come back.
They don't come back. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that happens a lot. I'm not saying that that's bad. I think that people do what makes sense to them afterwards, but then that people need to take that into account when they're choosing to do this, that you might flip your whole life upside down. And sometimes the whole field of psychedelic, they're a little bit irresponsible when talking about this. Because when I started to doing this, I just thought it was like, this is magic. You take this drug and then everything in your life changes for the better. But I don't think that this is always the case, and you need to be very aware of your intentions into something like that. But for people that have severe depression, for people that have addiction, strong PTSD, I think if your reality is already bad,
Yeah.
yes, welcome a change, But I think if you're just doing out of curiosity, it can be very dangerous, and you don't know what's going to happen with the things that you're so used and you're comfortable with now, you know.
All right. I'm sure we can have 2 hours discussion on psychedelics. So we'll move on to the next question I have for you. It would be centered around the self. I know you said you don't like using the word illusion, but we can't escape it here. Um, the self as an illusion. Neuroscience suggests that the unified self we experience is a construct of the brain, a narrative woven together by memory, perception, and prediction. That's true. Does free will or personal identity still hold meaning, or we are just observers of a story the brain tells us or tells itself? What's your take on that?
See, this is what I don't like, the idea of kind of dismissing something experience because it's a construct of the brain. I think for me, at least, it's obvious it's a construct of the brain. Yes, because we are a brain.
Yeah.
The ability that I have to speak, to think, our thoughts, all these concepts of the self, of free will, they are in the brain. Yes, it'd be like if we change our view into the topics of free will and the self, this is not even a question whether it's an illusion. I think actually the question should be different, is for us to try to understand the principles of the brain that allows us to have a self, to have free will. Because maybe I come from like a more human-centric experience. I tend to see things more from a general feeling and try to nail it down rather than try to connect little things.
The question, it's basically most times infused with philosophy. I think that's where the problem comes in. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we can think of the brain, and this would be like a start for us to try to understand this concept. Sort of all this like mystery around what's the mind or what consciousness is, and all sort of these more mental states that we have. They're very tangible to us as humans because we experience reality through our consciousness. We experience our brain through consciousness. We should start from sort of guiding principles
Mm-hmm.
rather than trying to dissect, where in the brain is free will, where in the brain is self. And I think in some ways the sort of like division between the mind and the brain, this is like so last century in a way, because I think but we inherit these notions because I guess like neuroscience wasn't even a field 50, 60 years ago. It was all psychology and philosophy. So I think we inherit some problems, let's say, maybe philosophy, from this disconnection of philosophy and psychology.
Yeah.
Because you're always trying to see there is your body that does something, and then there is your mind that does something else. I think we need to connect these two together, and we have to understand the principles that guide our bodies, even not just our brains but the whole body, because it's a super organism that has some laws of causality, causal relationships. Our whole body has one, and then it connects with the brain that has another set of causal relationships. And I think that maybe people don't like this, but I do think that consciousness is like an emergent thing that occurs. I do think it's emergent. But not in the sort of like magical sense of the, you have like a like some fairies or some glitter coming out of matter. Like that's not what I meant. But just in a sense that, you have two cells working together, or you have one cell that does one thing. In isolation, a cell does one thing. If you connect with other cells, it can become an organ, and then this organ becomes a body that then becomes, and then our minds, it kind of works on this. It's like an emergent property because the sum cannot be reduced to its parts, but the parts are part of the whole. So I think we need to change a little bit the way we try that we even ask these questions to actually come to the point that we understand our brains and our mind as some sort of set of fundamental principles that of how it works, rather than trying to dissect and try to find inside the brain, because the brain is not one part or another. It's always on, it's always interacting with outside of world, interacting with itself. So I think for me it's very hard to try to dissect this into little things.
Okay. So basically, what I get from this is the self, the quote unquote self, is not separate from the brain, and then it generates what we interpret as thoughts. So it's all one thing, basically.
Basically.
Yeah. I think the philosophical part of it that intrigues me is the free will part. I know the question has the part of it that says, are we just observing, or we taking action, or it's not even there and it's just a hallucination?
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot about this free will thing. I don't think it's a illusion. I do think we have free will, but it's like just by the way that the system is, because we cannot separate what the brain and what the mind is, that I think we get sort of like stuck, because you can say that everything that I've done so far in my life was because there was a neuron communicating with another neuron with another area of my brain that made me do that. Yes, yes, I agree with that. My brain was behind all of my actions so far. But whether that takes it away, I don't know. I think, at least I like to believe that we do have free will. And maybe this question is more about timing, rather like it's the thought that comes first or the physical part that comes first. And I don't know. What do you think? Do you think we have free will?
Yeah, I think it's still a huge debate amongst a lot of neuroscientists. I don't know if you know the neuroscientist Sam Harris. He has a strong argument against free will. He believes it's not real. I personally, I don't know. I think it's something that we might not be able to answer. I don't know, but like you said, it's up there. I think maybe one day science would answer the question if you ask me.
I think it comes from it depends on the perspective of how you want to see the question in the first place. Do you feel like you have free will? Does your subjective experience gives you the idea that you have free will?
Yeah, yeah. I think
Yes.
so. Yeah, the subjective experience, as I'm talking to you right now, gives the impression that I have it.
And I think that somehow this is enough. For me, I feel like this is enough. And this kind of goes back to maybe the theme of what I'm talking about. I think maybe I come from a more like human experience point of view that then uses the body to give rise to the human experience, rather than the body giving rise to the human experience, perhaps. So of course we have free will. I feel like I have free will. I feel like I can
We
choose to
feel,
go here and there.
yeah, we feel like it, but when you expand, we begin to realize that it's all conceptual. It's not planned. A lot of the things we do and say, it's not originated from us. Like, to give you an example, thoughts, the way ideas come to us, and we don't create thoughts. It's all conceptually. So, in a subjective way, in a very more primary way, I think we do, because I'm talking. But I think in a more broader sense, it might be more elusive.
And you have to think about, I guess, like what is reality to begin with to be able to answer that question. Because yes, I think everything that we do is based on things that we've done before. The same way that I was saying that our experience of reality is through our internal model of the world, that it begins being created when we're born, basically. So yes, I think that every decision that we make comes from this sort of like set of priors they already have. But I think my problem it's that I don't know how to run away from it. These questions, what would actually prove? Like, what would be the thing that we can prove? No, free will exists or doesn't exist. What it would be like a true free choice? Because we cannot. It's like you cannot explain away the rules of physics because you cannot be in a different universe that these rules don't exist. I think that this is maybe what I'm talking about when I feel like our idea of the brain should come from some sort of like set of principles like the laws of physics, then we wouldn't be asking questions whether this is biological or this is mental. If we understand that biological and mental is the same thing, so then I think some questions would just kind of disappear if we understand what is possible and what is really not possible to happen, because we cannot run away from the essence of what something is.
Sure. Okay, let's look. I think we'll probably go back a little into psychedelics. Psychedelics like psilocybin and DMT profoundly disrupt the default mode network. How do these mechanical changes translate subjectively into ego dissolution, encounters with entities, or a sense of cosmic unity? Is the brain revealing latent perceptual capacities or just hallucinating its own confusion? If it's okay, just go back and revisit just for a little bit.
To answer this question, maybe I'll touch a little bit in some of the findings that we had. On from my PhD work. It's not out yet. We're submitting the work, but I think there's a preprint out. But basically, just to be very simple, I did a lot of experiments during my PhD to try to understand something that we call context processing. And it's how the brain is able to differentiate between something that is familiar than something that is novel, something that is surprising. We did this in a very basic way. We showed mice images that were repetitive, and then it would be a sequence of, it was just like lines on a TV. And then out of sudden, like after a certain amount, these lines would change orientation. So it was just a surprise feeling. And we would see that, and this is a very sort of well characterized response of the visual cortex, that when this different image, this surprising, we call the oddball, was the oddball paradigm. So this oddball stimulus will show up, you have an activation, like increase in activation in the visual cortex of mice.
Yeah.
We call this a prediction error, in a sense. We could call this a prediction error. Because he had a expectation of this just going to be the same stimulus, and then it changed to this different one. And then I did some more exams to try to understand the connection of the frontal area of the brain with the visual cortex during the oddball paradigm. And we found that it's necessary for the frontal part of the brain to be connected to the visual part of the brain for this signal, this strong prediction error to occur, basically. What we saw during psychedelics is that there was a weakening connection from this top down, right, from higher areas of the brain. There was a decrease in the influence of these higher areas in the visual cortex. And then what we saw is that during this oddball paradigm, you will lose the different detection signal, but not in a sense that the brain will be quiet, but in a sense that you just sort of like the baseline of activity would increase. Our interpretation of this is that the brain was basically processing information. It lost the ability to contrast between what it knows than what it doesn't know. And then it was sort of processing irrelevant activity as prediction error. So it was giving relevance to different stimuli that don't necessarily is something that you don't know already, right? Because supposedly the brain should focus attention into the things that are new for you. This is like a principle for you to save energy and all of that. So we found that during the psychedelic experience, this sort of shifted. So you had a lot of sensory cues that were coming that in a normal sense, you wouldn't pay that much attention, or your brain wouldn't pay that much attention to it. But during the psychedelic experience, you have that. So I think that what happens during a psychedelic experience is that basically I think the hallucinations you have are some sort of like different parts of the brain that are coming alive, and they're being given relevance that maybe you wouldn't have in a normal setting, because you have this very strong sort of like this grabbing hand from your prefrontal, your frontal cortex, or like just not necessarily the prefrontal cortex, but higher areas of your brain, right? They have this grip on your sensory areas and more associative areas that then they kind of dictate how you're interpreting things. I think this encounters with entities and sort of this profound realizations and sort of expansion of consciousness, you do have a dissolution of ego, because our sense of self is very much based on the contrast that you have between your internal model and information that you receive. So your brain, through this sort of like cycle of always trying to predict what is happening and then giving attention to what is new, it creates a contrast, and then you contrast this with the outside world. If you lose the contrast, then you lose your sense of self, because you lose this internal model which through you look at reality.
Yeah.
um and this is just a speculation from my part. I think that what happens when you see these sort of entities and things from the outside world, you're kind of getting a glimpse of your own brain. These conversations and realizations that people have, it's somehow like thoughts that are inside your own mind already, hidden in some ways. And the brain, thoughts are so abstract in our brains.
Yeah.
We are only able to interpret thoughts and things as reality if they're encapsulated into something that we're used to, something familiar, like a person, like a animal, like something like this. And I think that this is sort of like the avenue that when your brain is that is in this psychedelic state that is very much like crazy, right? Like your brain is disconnected and it's a confusion. This sort of like the thoughts that get through, that they're still able to be generated by the brain, they come into the vessel of something that is familiar to you. And the brain has a sort of familiarity with creating faces and animals and sort of these more natural concepts, because we are constantly seeing faces and animals and evolutionarily speaking as well. So I think it's just sort of a way, like I always say that I think in a very like strong psychedelic experience, I don't think you're experiencing reality as the best way possible, sort of like true reality. I actually think you're experiencing your own brain in the most true sense ever. I think our sober consciousness is the truest way that we actually experience reality.
Do you think by any chance the memory plays a part? Like those entities and things that we imagine while we're under this the psychedelic effects, like incorporate things like maybe horror movies we've seen in the past, things that we've imagined, and it's pulling it out of our memories.
Yes. Yeah, it's like the brain library, you know.
Yeah.
And then it kind of pulls from that. And that's why I think that there's a general theme on these entities and how they look like. Some of them, they're like human-like, but a lot of them, they're dragged from animals and all sorts of different things. And then I think it's very culturally based, and also into the things that for your brain in the state that it is, it's better able to construct a little bit of like a coherent concept inside your mind.
What are when those hallucinations begin to cross the line and start to seem real? Like some people start to. I know you said you had experiments on people going through some psychosis, extreme psychosis, where people maybe start seeing things that are not there, or maybe start having a sense of touch from these entities. How do you explain those experiences when they begin to seem real and begin to seem that like they are here in the natural world?
Yeah, I think that's hard, but in a sense, then this invades your more this parts of the brain that are more directly in touch with the outside world, like your primary sensory areas, or this area of the brain that you feel your proprioception, which is like um the feeling of yourself, basically, in your boundaries and all that. I still have.
An example of that would be schizophrenia.
Yeah, people that like hear voices and they do see hallucinations. That it's is a misinterpretation of your brain of what your thoughts are. And again, I think you have a thought, and in some ways you don't interpret this as your own thought, and then the brain creates this sort of narrative of what that thought would be if it was, since it's not mine. Maybe there is this thing that like every time you make a movement there is like a corollary discharge, that like if I'm gonna touch my forearm, the movement that is gonna make me touch is also sending a signal to my sensory cortex in a way that to kind of like let me know that I'm gonna touch my forehead.
Mm.
So I have Like every movement comes with like a feedback of what that movement is going to affect my own body. If you think about this in some sort of like thought dimension, I think that this could be with this hearing voices. But I don't discard spiritual encounters and all of that. Like I don't mean to say all of this again, and I go back to, I don't think because it's a product of the brain, it doesn't mean it's not real. I just think that we have to expand our idea of what can be real and what cannot be real. It doesn't
So at
need
this
to, yeah.
so at this point, don't you think it's important we kind of define what real is? Because if we include quote unquote hallucinations and imaginations as real, where do we draw the line to what real is? What is real then?
I think real is something that you can be shared with more people. And this is a big point. And it goes back to the sort of connection between like people having a psychotic episode with people that had a very strong religious episode. Sometimes they're going to sound the same, but it depends on how many people believe them,
It becomes real, right?
Exactly. And you have no idea. I think so much about this, about what is the definition of sane and insanity. And I think like what my conclusion so far is it depends on the people that you surround yourself with and how much what is real for you can be shared with others, you know.
Okay. So
So
basically, it's how much your craziness is shared amongst your friends makes it real.
yeah, exactly. But so true. So you just have to surround yourself with the right people, then you're never gonna be insane. That's my take.
Okay, from an evolutionary perspective, why did traits favoring religious beliefs persist? How do we keep evolving with it still in our social evolution?
Faith is one of the most strong magnets of culture. It binds people together. If you go to the museums anywhere in the world, if you go to all these historical sites of things that endure years and years and years, they always have some sort of religious connotation to it. The temples and the churches and all of that. This is what stays because faith is something that brings people together. And I think that this is what honestly created society. And this goes wild, but I think that we started from sort of like animals, like human animal sort of instincts. We develop language, we develop culture. I think the moment that we realize that we die, I think this is a big mark as well. Sort of like the connotation of death that was so hard for the human mind to make sense of, that then we create a religion. And I think that the fear of death is something that people carry for centuries and centuries and centuries. And what kind of gives you a relief from this fear of death is religion in some sense. I mean, the pyramids in Egypt, like all the things that they did, just because they had this belief that after death is actually when you live. This brings people together beyond any sort of biological reasoning for this. There is a very big societal impulse why religion is so widespread, and to this day it is, and it will keep existing. I think as long as humans are born and die, we're gonna have faith, and then we're gonna have religion, and then we're gonna have society. I think that kind of the way else.
So basically, fear of death is why we have religion.
A little bit.
Okay, so let's go forward and talk about doubt versus dogma. If morality is processed differently in atheist versus the believer's brain, what does it say about dogma and doubt? The idea of dogma and doubt, being that dogma is more religious and then doubt is more atheistic. What do you think about those two stands, and how does the brain process these two things?
I guess like what comes to mind for me is that I feel like atheists, they would be, and I'm not giving any connotation to this word, more rational when it comes to explaining away things in life, I guess. And the more religious people, they would sort of, in some senses, accept, the idea of the mystery of some of the things that happen as well. My thing though is I think both of those are a system of beliefs, right? I don't think humans can exist without a system of beliefs, whether those are religious or those are scientific, those are rational or those are spiritual. I think they're all sort of the same thing. They're sort of they have some rules that you follow and then that you believe. And I mean, I consider myself a person of science,
Okay.
sort of ground everything that I experience into science. But I am a spiritual person in the ways that I interpret the things that I cannot explain in life, in the way that I pray for things that feels like a miracle. So I don't know.
Do you think those two things are compatible? Do you think spirituality and science are compatible?
I do think they are, and I want to believe that they are, and I want more people to think in this way. I think that we should be critical and think critically about everything that happens in our life. We should reflect about our behavior and about physical laws and try to understand reality to the most core of it. But I do think faith is a core of human existence. I think because we are a system of beliefs and because there is we are alive for a period of time, we don't know what happens afterwards. I think that it's in our soul to have a belief of something else because we actually and like it doesn't need to be this faith on like a white man on the sky. Some religions put it out as God. It can be just like a belief into the unknown. I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow because there is 7 billion more even billion people in the world, and every action from all these people impact one another because we are in the same universe. So you cannot, even if you have a very steady routine, you cannot know what's going to happen next. And having faith in the natural order of things and being a good person because you know that your actions affect the whole world. I think having faith and love in that sense completely fits into a scientific explanation too. I think definitely both of them should coexist, and scientists should be more open-minded to some of the interpretations. This happened with the psychedelic field for a really long time. They just dismiss this as like, oh, spiritual things, these people, blah blah blah. I think there is an explanation that tells that everything's in their brains, but then also gives validity to the divine transcendent experience that people go through. Yes, those two should coexist to give us a better understanding actually what the mind is.
Okay, yeah. Just to clarify from you, when you say fate, you're not aligning that with dogmatism, right?
No,
Okay.
it's just the feeling of wanting or hoping for something that you cannot directly um, touch, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Me too. I do tend to lean towards that. I do believe that there's something greater, but where I separate myself would be when it comes to the dogmatic nature of religion. I do not align myself with that. I think that's not scientific at all. So that's why I was asking, because the doubt is good, but some point there has to be an understanding. And then at the same time, having dogma and ritualism is very threatening to expanding knowledge.
Yeah, but in a sense, this dogmas, it's what sort of keeps, and I'm not agreeing with it. It's just like it's a tool for sort of manipulating people, manipulating the masses in some ways.
Yeah.
And
That's the
and
dangers
to
of
be
it.
honest, yeah, throughout history, this is what survives. It's a very sort of obedient society that follows specific rules. This kind of like stays strong, and this is sort of the things that survive most history are these very strong religious dogmatic things.
Okay, let's move into what we both love, consciousness, which is the hard problem. In your own word, what is consciousness to you? How do you define it?
Like my personal feeling of what consciousness is, and that's very simple, is subjective experience. And then maybe there is the more scientific and philosophical idea of what I think it actually is. But consciousness for me is the ability of interacting with the world and having sort of like a universe within yourself that interacts with the universe outside of the world. I think this is what consciousness is.
Okay, that's beautifully put. I know you probably know about the heart problem by David Chalmers. Do you think this is from a neuroscientific perspective? Do you think we're any close to fully understanding it, or is consciousness fundamentally beyond the reach of reductionist science?
I think it's It's hard to understand consciousness because we are conscious, and our consciousness is limited to a certain degree into how much we can understand itself. I think this also could be a protective mechanisms of your own mind, because if you really understood what consciousness is, maybe they will break us. I don't know. But maybe not. I do want to understand that. But I don't think that we're going to find like a region of the brain and say this is consciousness. I think in any way that we understand consciousness is going to be from like a set of fundamental principles, that it's going to be sort of like a summation of different factors within the brain. I think our whole brain is consciousness. I guess you can take some parts of it and you're still conscious, yes. But I think that it cannot be reduced so much because it's for me, an emergent property of matter.
If we built AI that perfectly mimicked the human brain activity, would it be conscious, you think?
No,
Okay.
I'll give my argument to this.
Okay.
And it goes back that we cannot run away from our biology. I think we are made of living things. Like ourselves, if you look for like evolutionary period, like long time ago, when life began in the oceans, those are elements that are all separated, and then eventually they got together, and then there was a membrane around it, and then it will start, having some sort of boundary and like a self-sustaining sort of like a feedback loop within itself to stay alive, and then it connected to other cells. And then, so if you look at our bodies as a collection of individual organisms that are working towards a ultimate goal of survival and success and expansion, this is like the cell in the bottom of my foot is as important for my consciousness as the cells in my brain. It's because we are a body, that are the matter that constitutes ourselves is alive. The cell in my liver wants to be alive as much as me in my head want to be alive. And then this sort of like consciousness is some sort of like expression of this imperative of life that comes from the matter that we are made of to begin with. I don't think that computers, even if you mimic the human brain exactly how it is never going to have this imperative of aliveness because it's made of material that is not as alive as a human cell, basically.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm with you on this. I don't think machines or AI can ever be conscious. Although I've heard one evolutionary biologist argue that it might one day, Brett Weinstein. But just to push back a little bit on what you said something about even the cells in your brain and the ones in the bottom of your feet all come together to make consciousness a reality. What about in the instances where people get amputations and they get their legs cut off, but they're still conscious? But the limbs that have been cut off are not conscious.
I mean, because you still have other cells in your body. And I guess like if you cut enough limbs and then you kill a person, then she's not conscious anymore. I think as long as, and if you think about, if someone had an amputation, the cells that are like surrounding the wound of that amputation, they're fighting. They're fighting. They're trying to stay alive one by one, and some of them die, and then you have other cells that go and kind of clean it up, the dead cells, and then there's like a instigation of making new cells. Your body is fighting the same way that you fight to be alive and you fight to live your life and to have your success. It's the same imperative, and that's what I mean about fundamental principles of how life works and how the brain works. If we understand that our bodies kind of come from the same principle, but and I don't want to say complexity because our bodies are very complex, but it's sort of like a level below the sort of let's say complexity, the complexity of our feelings of our consciousness, because I think the consciousness really is sort of like our interpretation. It's like the body best shot of interpreting the reality outside you and the reality of your body. So it's also a mechanism of protection.
Huh.
I think that it definitely serves an evolutionary point of you having the best interpretation of what reality is in the world. So that's why we look at plants, or like we look at the color green, and we don't just see this wavelength of life. We see green, and then we can recognize the same wave of life in plants and different things, and then you can associate that with something else. Like, I think that consciousness is something that your body evolved to be able to better interpret the world.
Is it kind of separate from us, or do we generate consciousness? Because if let's say, for example, if you keep cutting off limbs, you said at some point we would die. So if there's a point where consciousness is lost, does it mean that that part is where the consciousness is being generated from?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about it. I guess, like, if I were to put consciousness in one specific place, I would put it in the head. I think definitely the brain is
In
a
the
big
brain,
part.
yeah, definitely.
It's sort of the substrate, like the substrate of what brings it alive. I just mean that I think that the brain is also highly connected to the body in a lot of senses.
Yeah.
I see the brain as this like headquarters of like a super organism. And if you think about what the precursors of cells of the brain was basically this, like, the cells that learn how to send information through electrical discharges. And it was a way for you to, like, you have an organism that is big, and then you want to know, want to know in this part of, let's say, like, on your head, what's happening on your foot. But like, imagine like just like a, no, like an actual human body, but like a blob of cells into the ocean, of an ancient ocean. These neurons developed so you could have this long distance communication. So whatever happened, oh, so I'm sensing this chemical here in my tail, and then this is bad for me, so then I need to send this signal to this other part of this body, this organism, so then this can start doing something for me to get away from this chemical that is bad, in a very simplistic way. So these neurons are processing information, basically. And the brain is the headquarters. It's the place that all this information kind of comes through. And then I think the evolution, that when you start having not just neurons that connect the body in different ways and give reflexes, you had like a centralized nervous system. And then this is what it start getting interesting, is because your neurons in your centralized nervous system is starting to also take into account to each other. So it's not just about, oh, this sensory neuron in my leg is sensing a bad chemical or something that burns, so then I need to pull the muscle and reflect. It's also like, okay, so I'm receiving this information inside the centralized nervous system. So then the information that I receive is also taken into account of this other part of the brain itself that is processing another information. So then you kind of have like its own sort of feedback loop inside the brain itself. There's like top down, bottom up communication that happens. So, and then I think in somewhere there that you generate the consciousness the way that we are. But I think that is necessary for you to have a, not per se, and maybe this is the confusion. It doesn't need to be a body, but the matter, the material in which you are needs to be alive. So the computers with bits and electrical currents, it's not alive. Those little pieces of elements don't want to be alive as much as my cells want to be alive. So then I want to be alive because my cells want to be alive. This is my kind of take on it.
So yeah, so they cannot feel pain or joy at any time, and they will not be able to find or reach the state of consciousness.
But they probably will be very good at mimicking it.
So you being in the field of neuroscience, how has neuroscience changed our understanding of mental health disorders? And what emerging treatments show the most promising, you think? Problems like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, psychological problems.
No, I guess maybe I've been a bit critical about a lot of things here, but I appreciate you for giving me this outlet in some ways. I guess I have
No, you,
of this.
that's the whole point of it. Yeah.
And I mean, who am I, right? Like, yeah, I love a good philosophical and scientific discussion. So there is studies and people that are pushing a different way, but I think that the way that we interpret mental disorders, I think there is a problem because of the way that there's like so many different disorders and a lot of things overlap. And we try, and it's very hard. Like, mental disorders are a very hard thing to treat because I think people are fundamentally very different. So, the set of treatments that we have for schizophrenia, terrible, terrible. The best that we have so far is dopamine blockers. and this has different effects on people. And usually people with schizophrenia don't want to take their medication because it blunts a part of themselves as well. And also there is some symptoms and side effects into motor movement and all of that. Antidepressants are something that help, but also is a hit or miss. Sometimes you need to kind of go through a lot of trials and errors for you to get it right. So the place where neuroscience is, I think it's good. I think in the places that we develop new technologies recently to look at the brain and manipulate the brain and learn new things. The field is growing very rapidly and very nicely. But I think in the way that this translates to changing human lives, I think it's a little bit slow at the moment. And I know science is slow and all of that. But again, I think it bottles down into the fact that we need to sort of understand the human brain a little better and having some sort of like fundamental theory of the human experience. And then from that, we can maybe have a better sense of how to treat these disorders, because a lot of people that have depression, they also have anxiety. And then there's people that have psychotic episodes, and then they are bipolar, and then they also have depressive phases. And everything kind of comes from like an imbalance that is happening in the brain. It's beyond imbalance of chemicals, lack of serotonin or too much dopamine that plays a role. I think, though, that the actual functional effect is a level higher. It's more in how different areas of the brain communicate with each other. And maybe I'm biased because of my PhD work, because it was on the effects of top-down and bottom-up connections. But we do need a better understanding of this mental disorders in general. We could talk more specifically about one or another, but I think in general, we're still lacking. And people are trying to do the best that they can. And I think some of the things are really good, but there's a lot of room for improvement, I'll say.
So you feel we would do better in the science field if we had more real life experiences instead of just being structural and being data driven. Maybe we should look at from the angle of the people experiencing it. Is that
Yeah, 100%.
okay?
100%. Because I feel that the research that we can do into humans and then animals, a lot of the research we do is in animal models and understanding of what is depression for a mouse. We have some paradigms, like you put a mouse on the water and you see if it would swim to rescue itself. If not, it's depressed, like something like that. There could be some good markers for the beginning, but I think that it's so far away from the actual human experience of what it means to be depressed, what it means to be anxious. We define anxiety in mice work, rather a mouse, you put in an open field, whether a mouse wants to be close to the wall or he's comfortable being in the open field. I think that a instinct that demonstrates that the mouse is afraid or not. But anxiety, that's like the human experience of anxiety is completely different.
Yeah, it
Even if you just have more people that do like mouse behavior work to read more or have more like a critical thinking of what it means to have these disorders in real life, I think that would be more helpful.
okay. So you don't think there's any emergent treatment at the moment, but you think that's something in the future that's promising if we change the way we attack these issues.
I think that the psychedelics thing, again, with caution, done correctly in like a clinic with good people guiding it and with like a very good interpretation of the like follow up, like not follow up, but people have someone beforehand, during, and after. I think it can be really great. You can save a lot of people with psychedelics, especially people with addiction and very, very severe depression and big traumas. I think it can definitely help. If I would say this could be the most promising treatments that are out there.
That's fantastic because I've looked at some research and studies, and it seems very promising. I'm just not happy about the way it's been shown and not broadly exploited. I don't know if there's a reason why, but I've heard a lot of people who have individually spent their own life and time and money doing researches. So why do you think the scientific world is not like exploring it aggressively?
Well, I think it's starting a little bit. The whole psychedelic field is trending a bit recently. I mean, but that was a very big historical prejudice against it. That started on the 70s, right? So because people were using so much, and then it was different time and era back then, but the politicians really thought it was threatening their power. So they just cut off all research regarding it. And I think it also comes from this problem with some scientists and this even also it was a problem with the study of consciousness that a lot of scientists, they're so sort of stuck in their mindset of like observational science because the scientific method and all of that they discard things that are a little bit more subjective because also it's harder to study subjective experiences. So people also this spiritual part, right? People, it's just so easy to dismiss like, oh no, these people are just having a trip and seeing things and blah blah blah. But again, it's the brain doing it.
Yeah.
It's a biological thing. We should understand the brain is capable of that. And I think in those experiences, it shows even more how the brain is capable of this religious transcendent experience. This means something. And it can be very helpful for people that feel stuck in their own lives without this sort of connection. So I think we're walking in the right path when it comes to this. I do think sometimes people should be a little cautious about the way they advertise this. It should be, and that's why you should have serious people researching it, and then you should allow specific clinical trials to go through. So then you can have treatments based on science. Because nowadays you don't have that. And then it's like if you don't put some restriction on how things are done, then anyone can do it, basically. And then it can get messy. You know, people that are not very prepared.
Yeah, that is true, and a lot can go messy when it comes to human. And we have like just 3 more questions to go, so we'll just run through that real quick. If our brains operate on biological and environmental algorithms with every thought, emotion, and decision traceable to neural processes, does accepting this determinism actually foster greater empathy when we recognize that bad behavior stems from maybe misfiring circuits and maladaptive wiring? Does it become harder to blame others and easier to help them? Or does this view risk reducing human agency to mere machinery, like stripping away the meaning of accountability? What do you think? Is it going to be a dangerous thing to do?
No, I mean, I liked that idea, but I think you can at the same time understand that people are the way that they are because of the context that they are in, and also give them agency, you know?
Yeah.
Give them some level of agency. I think definitely free will exists. There's different degrees of free will. I think someone that is addicted to drugs has a smaller free will because you give your body this sort of like stimulant so much that then the body craves, and then sort of like this, let's say if usually you just have a balance between what your mind wants and what your body wants, and it's an interplay between both. When you have an addiction, this sort of like body necessities go so high that it influences your mind so much. So you have a shorter, like a smaller degree of free will in that sense.
Okay, but in the sense of that and the drug addiction, that is like a self-caused problem. What if we go to the extreme and say we use an example of somebody with quote unquote schizophrenia and they commit a murder and we arrest them and then we find out that it was a mental disorder. How do we go about that in the future?
I think that that's a very hard question. Maybe there's not like a black and white answer, right? Like there's not like, okay, it's all about
'Cause
biology.
free will goes out the window at that point.
Yeah, yeah. I think when you have a disorder like that, because schizophrenia unfortunately is a disorder that touches this much more conscious part of your brain. Sometimes these people, they're not gonna kill someone because they just want to do it because they're mean, because they're bad. You know, they sometimes do it because they have this very complicated conspiracy in their minds that they think that this person is trying to kill them, you know. So for them it's self-defense.
Yeah.
So if you were to try to understand the reality that this person created in their minds for them is real, maybe I wouldn't blame them so much. But then it's again like, what is reality? Can you share this reality? Is this real for more people than just that person? Probably not. So then this person should just, in some ways, get medication and be in an institution, right? So I think it depends on the degree, but I do like the idea that we can be more empathetic to each other if we do understand that we cannot run away so much from all the influences that we have in life while still having agency to change some behaviors and to understand each other, understand one another, right?
That is true. Yeah, more empathy is needed in this world. I would back that. I would agree with that 100%. The last two questions. It's gonna be the attraction of male and female. How does the brain chemically choreograph shape who we are drawn to? How does the brain help us pick our mates? Things like spark or chemistry, just subconscious neurobiological evaluations, or is there more to it?
But again, like it depends on your context. I think there's so many different factors that play into how you're attracted to people. It's so hard to nail down. And again, definitely in your brain, right? Definitely in the context that you live in. I do believe that. But it depends on the situation you are at the moment in your life, and then how the timing works for you, and what sorts of, and I think that can change a lot as well. But I think that there is a sort of fundamental desire for every human being to connect with others, whether it's through like a romantic relationship that's going to lead to marriage, or it's through friendship, or it's through mentorship, it's through family. I think that we do have these desires, and this it's very good for the brain, again, because if we talk about what is real for you is what you can share with other people. It's very important to have people around you that sort of validate your view of life in general. It's a sanity check in a lot of ways. And I think a relationship beyond the sort of like survival and reproduction sense is also a place of like mental stability.
Do you think we'll pick more partners better if we infuse science and data to the process?
But yeah, maybe there is. You could have some compatibilities, right? Some sort of test like that could, especially because I think nowadays people are a little bit more disconnected with one another in big community encounters than you used to have in the past. Because marriage was something much more essential in the past. Also, there's so many factors if you can talk about this. But I think nowadays it's a little harder
Yeah.
to meet people and connect with people. And I say this from a perspective of someone that I love people. And every chance that I have, I'm trying to get all my friends to meet my friends, and throw parties, and get together. And I think this is essential. I'm standing for human nature here, should connect more with each other. Relationships are complicated. I don't know if bringing science into it, I don't know how much that could really help.
How much change is gonna make anyways? Because people change in the future. What is the guarantee that the person will not be influenced in a year or two to be somebody else?
And like, and I say this as a hopeless romantic, but getting into relationships is one of like the craziest, most unpredictable things that you can do. I mean, it's really a risk. Like you
Yeah.
take a shot in the dark of like, I love this person and I want this person to be with me, but you don't know. And it affects you in a lot of ways. So but I think it's one of the greatest risks of being a human.
Yeah, being alive. Yeah, I think so too. It's a
I feel.
big risk, yeah, because you're opening up all your vulnerabilities to somebody else, and that's a big thing. Yeah. Okay. So in conclusion, I'll ask you probably not really personal, but answers that you can give me. Someone just starting to learn about neuroscience. How would you describe the most fundamental functions of the brain in simple terms?
Let me think for a second. Survival, connection, prediction. So I think the brain is a system that interprets the outside world and gives the best prediction of what can happen for your own survival. And at this level that we have of the brain for connection with not just the outside world as the physical reality, but other people with brains as well. This sort of connection.
Second one, what's one recent discovery in neuroscience that has excited you the most? And how could it change our understanding of the brain? Anything new in the field that excites you?
Don't know. I have maybe a hard time answering that question. I'm studying right now in my work epilepsy.
Okay.
So I did sort of diverge a little bit from all these more philosophical questions. Maybe I would say, and this is not so recent, but all the advancements that has been happening lately with this predictive coding. Have you heard about predictive coding? It's one interpretation, sort of like a framework to understand how the brain works. And this idea that the brain is sort of constantly predicting sensory information. And it's sort of like what I was talking about with the oddball paradigm that I was saying with the prediction error that occurs when something novel comes. I think that all recent discoveries or interpretations of predictive coding, it's not that new, to be honest, probably 20 years, but it's like a little bit what I'm talking about talking about fundamental principles of how the brain works. I think predictive coding is one of those. It might not be perfect, but I think it's a very good start to trying to understand how the brain works. And they have this sort of on top of predictive coding, there's this Rebels model that is an interpretation of the psychedelic effect based on predictive coding. And if you haven't heard of it, I can send you the name of it and read. I think you'll feel that as well.
Oh, that would be great. I would love to. I'd love to read about it. Okay.
So
So
maybe this is sort of the direction that I would take into neuroscience.
awesome. Awesome. Okay. So finally, the big question. If you solve one big mystery about the brain in your lifetime, what would it be and why?
I think we should lay down the fundamental principles of the human existence. This is maybe my goal in life in some ways, in my own sort of little world, in my own mind at least. And this gets to the question of consciousness, free will, and all of these sort of artifacts, of not artifacts, but phenomenon that we experience as conscious being with a mind. But I think that we should solve and have like a unifying framework of what are the principles of brain functioning the same way that we have the laws of physics. I think we should have the laws of human existence. And then from that, I think we can solve so many different problems if we get to actually the principles of how humans work. It's just a small thing, you know?
That's very interesting. Thank you so much. It was awesome having you. Hopefully, we can get you on sometime soon in the future, and maybe after you're publishing, that would be awesome. So we could talk about it. Thanks for your swift response and coming on. It was really interesting and learned a lot. Thank you.
Well, no, I appreciate it. And thanks so much, really, for giving me this opportunity. The questions that you asked has been things that I've been thinking about for the past like year or so. Just this was the reason why I wanted to do neuroscience in the first place.
Wow,
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. It's really good for me.
it was great. I like your inputs, the opinions, and the ideas. Loved
Okay.
it.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Qualia Experience Podcast, Distorted Reality, the Neuroscience of Consciousness. We hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as we enjoyed making it. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe to stay connected so you don't miss our upcoming releases. Until next time, stay safe, and thank you for being a part of